All right, guys, Mike Massie.
Hey everyone. So this is cozy. So if you were at Jasmine Walt's Fantasy Fest in Boston, this is the same presentation I gave there. So I apologize if you're seeing it twice, but it's gonna be the same presentation. So my name is Michael Massie. I write fiction by the pen name of M.D. Massie. And the reason why I chose that pen name was because it was close to my name, but I didn't want to confuse people that had read my nonfiction before. I wrote nonfiction books for the martial arts industry because I have been doing martial arts for 36 years now. So I started when I was a young man, really, I was in junior high. And got beat up by the school bully. And so I decided I was I was a nerd. I was a huge nerd. Decided I was going to take martial arts to go back and do the Karate Kid thing. And then once I got into it, I kind of discovered some self-confidence and stuck with it. So that ended up becoming a career for me later when I got out of the service. My Taekwondo instructor had stopped teaching and I wanted him to start teaching again. So I ended up starting a school to give him a place to teach. And that was the first of like 6 martial arts schools that I've owned. I'm actually on the 6th one right now. I've been writing full-time for 3 years, but I've actually been teaching Krav Maga full-time for the last year. So needless to say, I'm kind of burned out, but that's going to end soon. I'm getting back to writing. I'm going to let my school go back to teaching full-time. So over that 35 years, I've studied different martial arts. Being a martial arts, kind of fanatic, I would start in one martial art, get to a certain level, usually about the last belt before black belt, or I would get a black belt or instructor rank, and then move on to another martial art. So I ended up getting black belts in karate and taekwondo, hapkido. I got some crossover rank in Japanese jiu-jitsu. I've gotten a blue belt in Brazilian jiu-jitsu. That's a very challenging martial art. Any of you guys that do Brazilian jiu-jitsu know that, ladies too. And then most recently, about 5 years ago, a buddy of mine that I grew up with, who is a security professional and professional kickboxer, trains MMA fighters and professional kickboxers. His son actually just won the world championships, amateur championships. He convinced me to start doing Krav Maga. And I was already doing reality-based self-defense. I had been doing reality-based self-defense styles for about 10 years. And I was convinced that I knew everything about reality-based self-defense. I traveled around, taught seminars, certified other instructors. Our program was taught in a dozen martial arts schools, on and on. So after bugging me for a while, I respect the guy's opinion because of his background. And I went and took a Krav Maga class, and I was hooked. So I've been doing Krav Maga for the last 5 years, and I'm probably going to test for my black belt. I got invited to test for my black belt, which you have to be invited in Krav Maga. So I'm probably going to test for my black belt soon. So yeah, appreciate that. But why am I telling you all this? The reason why is because I want you to know that when I tell you about fight scenes, I'm going to explain this from 2 different perspectives. And one perspective is the fantastic perspective, which I'll explain in a minute, and the other perspective is the reality perspective, because I think that's an area where most writers have a knowledge deficit. And I will say this for a fact. Most martial artists have a knowledge deficit of what happens in reality when people actually commit violence, when you have to defend yourself against somebody committing a violent act. I learned that the hard way. When I was in the service, I'd been training for about 7 or 8 years. The guy I was training with on Fort Hood, where I was stationed, was an ex-Green Beret. He did 3 tours in Vietnam. He would tell you with a straight face that he was like, my specialty was silent sentry takeout. He was one of those guys. He was a tough guy. So I thought I was really, really good at self-defense. I thought I knew what I was doing. And I had 2 experiences that taught me otherwise. One, I got attacked by a guy who knew just as much martial arts as I did. He'd been stationed in Korea for the last 8 years, but he was a lot meaner. And he had actually been in a lot of fights. And that guy whooped me good. So that was one experience. And the other experience was I was home on leave. And, as young men do, we were out drinking, several of my friends. And somebody decided to try to shoot their wife. And I had to step in and take the weapon away and so forth, And both those experiences taught me that I didn't know very much about combat. So that started me on a journey of learning as much as I could about what real fights are like and, how self-defense works. And so that's what I've been doing for about the last 20 years. So today in our presentation, let me see if I got this working. Maybe not. Hang on. Today in the presentation, we're going to go over, there we go. Understanding fight scenes, so you guys can write better fight scenes. So, in fantasy fiction, which is what I write, fight scenes can be gritty and realistic or supernatural and fantastic. And that goes just as well for any other genre of fiction, because when you're writing fiction, you have artistic license. So you can make your fight scenes as fantastic as you want. You just have to justify it, which is what we're going to talk about later. And there it goes again. Okay, I guess I'm going to be behind the podium. So, which route you choose is going to depend on your characters, settings, and the overall tone of your story. Now, functions of fight scenes. The first function of your fight scenes is pacing, to set the pacing for your story. Are any of you familiar with the Lester Dent approach to writing fiction? Anybody like a Pulp Fiction writer fan? Okay. So Lester Dent, yeah, you can look it up online. Michael Moorcock actually wrote a lot of his fiction based on how Lester Dent wrote his fiction. And Lester Dent would crank out these 10,000, 20,000 word stories, and that's how he made most of his money. And he was a renowned Pulp Fiction writer back in the day. And one of the things that he had, one of his rules was to have conflict every 1,500 words. So what I found was when I started doing that in my fiction, that I started getting more positive feedback about my stories. So that's what I try to do. And I use fight scenes to set the pacing in my story and to make my stories more exciting. The second thing is punishment. One of the rules of writing fiction is that we want to heap punishment on our characters. We want to make sure that, as one writer said, you make your characters bleed and then you make them bleed some more. So fight scenes give you the opportunity to heap trouble on your characters, to make things more exciting, and to raise the stakes. Also, satisfaction. This is satisfaction for your readers. Remember that a lot of readers, and I know a lot of you guys are fiction readers, we all are probably, right? But your readers read your books in part for wish fulfillment. That's the reason why in certain genres, I'd say in most genres, readers prefer protagonists that are smart alecks, okay? That say things to people that we wouldn't normally say in real life. And the reason why is, who doesn't like to see the bad guy or the bad girl get their comeuppance? So fight scenes provide that element for your readers when they're reading their books, so you can really stick it to the bad guy in a way that's exciting and that's satisfying for the reader. Okay, so we want to begin with the end in mind. First thing you want to think about when you're forming a fight scene, when you're planning out a fight scene, is what purpose does the fight scene fulfill? Because they can fulfill different purposes. The first is it going to move the plot or the story forward? Now, I will say, if you're following kind of that Lester Dent method of writing fiction, and you're just trying to add more fight scenes and more conflict and so forth to keep the story interesting, and that's fine, okay? But at a certain point, you have to realize that if you just have meaningless fight scenes every chapter, every other chapter, it's going to get boring for the readers. The fight scenes have to have meaning. And what that means is you have to tie in your fight scenes, the conflict, with the main characters, the main theme, the main plot, and the subplots in the book. Okay? It can't just be your character running around getting in around fight scenes. So you want your fight scenes to move the story forward. The next thing is it going to reveal something about the character? Violence is a form of communication. I can tell you this. I can watch two people fight, whether it's a video of two people fighting for real on YouTube, or whether it's an MMA match, or a couple of boxers, or a couple of students in my gym fighting. I can tell a lot about somebody by how they fight. I can tell how they feel about the other person, because people fight a lot differently when they are just defending themselves and they don't really want to be there, and when there's something personal. So when there's something personal involved, you're going to see people fight a lot harder and a lot nastier. So you want to remember that when you're writing your fight scenes, when you're crafting your fight scenes in your stories. Okay, now, will the fight scene set up later events? For example, leading to the point of no return. So you're ending the first act of your book. Many times you can use a fight scene to create that point of no return in your story. So that's another good reason for having fight scenes in your book that are exciting, okay? Also, the climactic scene in your story, in your novel. The big climax, it's really important. One of the things we have to remember when we're creating fight scenes in our novels is that if your previous fight scenes are more exciting than your final fight scene, it's going to be very disappointing for your readers and you're going to get bad reviews. You always want to make sure that your final fight scene is like, the big hurrah. It's got to be something that just blows you readers away. In my main series, the Colin McCool series, I just finished, a couple of months ago, I finished book 9. And this is the 3rd tetralogy, because I write my books in arcs of 4 books. I was stuck for how to top things. I was like, man, how am I going to make this final fight scene something that's going to excite people? And I spent weeks. I probably spent, I would say, easily 30% of the time I spent writing that book on the last few chapters to make sure that it was satisfying for the readers. And the good news is that I got feedback from my readers saying that it was, one reader said it was the best fight scene he'd ever read. And so, that's the type of stuff, when you get that feedback from readers, you're like, wow, I did my job. And then you go back and you write another novel and you're like, oh, this sucks. I can't write anything, right? That's the way it works. But that's the response, obviously, that we all want. Okay, so 4 things every fight scene needs. The first thing is a cause, something that instigates the fight. What starts the fight? In real life, fights don't happen just because. And I'm going to get to that in a minute. But, there's always something that sets up the fight. Maybe it's 2 people arguing over parking space, okay? Maybe it's somebody, thinks that another person is hitting on their paramour, right? Like their boyfriend or girlfriend or wife or husband, okay? Could be any number of things, but you have to figure out some sort of conflict, something that's going to instigate the fight, and it has to be a good enough reason to start the fight. You have to think about your characters in context. How, what is your character's personality, and would they actually respond in such manner? You have to be consistent, because if you have your characters responding in an inconsistent manner, in an inconsistent way, just to start a fight, so you can have a fight scene in that part of the book, your readers are going to pick up on it pretty quickly, and they're going to be pretty disappointed. Okay, so the second thing is, fight scene needs to have an opening salvo. That's the initial attack or exchange. Now, I will tell you, in real life, many times, real life fights don't go beyond this. Typically, especially if it's somebody who's very practiced at violence, typically criminal predators, they understand the ambush attack very well, so they'll ambush people, and the fight never goes beyond this, okay? It's only when you're looking at like movie fights, or when 2 people don't know what they're doing in real life, okay? They're just like kind of throwing punches at each other. Or in sporting matches, like combat sports, MMA, kickboxing, jiu-jitsu, et cetera, where fights last a long time. And the only time in those situations they don't is when there's an incredible skill differential, where one person is just so much better than the other person, they just outclass them. So you need to set up your fight with an opening salvo, and it has to be something that's interesting, that catches the reader's interest. So it can't just be, person A threw a punch at person B and person B ducked. You've got to think about crafting the language in such a way to where the way you're describing that opening salvo says something about each character. Readers are probably going to be already familiar with your main character, but the person they're fighting, maybe not. So just by talking about how that person, their eyes narrow or they clench their fist, we're going to talk about pre-indicators of violence in a minute, by the way. Or how they hold, if they have a weapon, how they hold their weapon, how they hold their knife, how they stand, how they crouch. Certain readers that are very savvy about fighting and about martial arts, and there's a lot of them out there, because a lot of us nerds are martial arts heads, right? Okay, people like to do martial arts. Or they do LARPing, or they do, SCA or something like that. They're going to pick up on those things, and it's going to make your book more interesting for those readers. So remember that. Also, your fight needs to have an ebb and flow. The question, who will win, should not be a foregone conclusion. In any fight scene, sometimes you may want to have your main character just dominate somebody and, get them over quickly just to show, to establish, how tough or how ruthless or whatever that character is. But if it's a major fight scene in your book, typically in my novels, my characters will go through try-fail cycles. I don't know if you do that in your own novels as well when you're plotting them out. But during my try-fail cycles, at the end of the book, when I'm coming up to the point where we're going to have the big climax, we're going to have that, that doomsday moment, and then there's going to be the big climax. I want to make sure that each fight that my character faces escalates in danger for the character and stakes, each and every fight. And so to do that, you have to make sure that in your fights that there's ebb and flow, that your character kind of gets they get kind of an edge on the other person or whatever, and then it goes the other way. Then they're getting beat up. On the plane here today, I was actually reading one of the Joe Ledger novels. I'm going back because a new one just dropped, and it's Jonathan Mayberry's series. So the Joe Ledger series is probably one of the best series to read for understanding how to write good fight scenes, because Jonathan Mayberry he is a master of writing fight scenes. And one of the reasons why is because he understands violence, because he's a martial artist and so forth, but also he does the work. He goes in and he talks with people who, interviews people who really do the type of work that his characters do, whether it's, CIA or government or, military, whatever, and he understands how those people operate. And I can tell you something, you read a Joe Ledger novel, you're going to understand how good fight scenes are written. So ebb and flow is a big thing. It's a very important thing that Jonathan Mayberry does, and he does it so well. Okay, and then finally a big finish. An escalation of action is what you want, something that builds up into crescendo, and you kind of want it until the last minute, You don't want the readers to know which way it's going to go. And obviously, as you're building up toward that final act in your book, you want to make sure that your main character loses. And you might make them lose big. And the bigger that they lose, the more satisfying it's going to be when they come back against the big bad at the end of the book and, they have their day. Okay, so remember that. That crescendo, you want it to be something that just, the reader's just like, whoa. And if you can throw a twist in there as well, that's even better. All right, now, the last thing is you want to consider the after-action report. You want to consider, what are you going to tell the reader about what happens after the fight? What are the consequences of the fight? Were there any consequences? There are always consequences for violence, I can tell you that, in real life. Maybe in fantasy, perhaps not so much, depending on the rules of your world. But in real life, there are always consequences. There are always social consequences, legal consequences, which are civil and criminal. And sometimes there are physical consequences as well, quite often, as a matter of fact. So you have to think about that. Write your after-action report. Give the reader just a little bit more of exposition to let them know, this is what happened, or expose that in dialogue later. Maybe the character runs into somebody that they fought before, and they have a little back and forth that kind of shows that maybe there's some hostility there, somebody's holding a grudge or whatever. All right, now, setting up a great fight scene. The first thing is real danger. Is there real danger to the protagonist? I think the best example in recent history of doing this right and doing this wrong is to compare the Luke Cage Netflix series and the Black Panther film, okay? So both films had incredible potential. In my opinion, I think the writers dropped the ball with Luke Cage, and the reason why was because you never really felt like Luke Cage was in danger. I mean, he's Power Man. He's bulletproof. He can lift, I don't know, it varied in the comics, sometimes 40 tons, sometimes 70 tons, sometimes 80 tons. But, he was just a superhuman person. And who did they put him up against in the series? Well, they put him up against, like, normal people with guns. Okay, well, I already know the guy's bulletproof, Give him somebody, give him, like, a really good, strong antagonist to fight. But they never did that in the series. The best that they did is they gave him, like, armor-piercing, exploding bullets. And even then, you knew that he was going to come back from it. Well, in Black Panther, they did it differently. When they introduced the bad guy, the villain, Killmonger, they introduced him as somebody who was kind of a mystery at first. And what they did, which was interesting in the first act, is they had Black Panther dealing with Claw. And they kind of made Claw out to be a big deal. And then, of course, he gets killed by who? He gets killed by Killmonger, okay, who's the main villain. So all of a sudden, you're like, whoa, this guy's kind of bad. What's the deal with him? Well, then the writers were smart enough to give Killmonger every power that Black Panther had, and they took Black Panther's powers away, basically. So what they did was they set up conflict, and they set up danger in such a way to where you're like, wow, this really sucks for the main character, We don't know if he's going to get through this. I mean, you get to see him get destroyed in that waterfall scene. And that sets up everything after that, because after that, you're like, wow, there's some real stakes now. Not only does he have to get his people back, he has to get his powers back. This other guy has all his powers. He's got all his money. He has all those resources. And that's what you need to do for your main character. If you really want to set high stakes for that last battle, that's the type of thing that you have to do. And that's why Black Panther did so well, and why Luke Cage, in my opinion, was met with and I'm not, no pun intended, lukewarm reception. Okay, so high stakes. This is what I just talked about. What will the protagonist lose if they're defeated? What will happen to their loved ones, community, city, nation, etc.? And, once again, going back to Black Panther, he'll lose everything. Everything if he loses, And his people will lose everything. because they're going to be, led by this, this evil kind of angry dictator. Now, another thing I will say about that, that villain, Killmonger, and this is something that I think they did wrong by killing him off because he was such a great character. It was like killing off Darth Maul, right? Because you loved Darth Maul. Darth Maul was just, he was just, you wanted him to keep going because you're like, wow, this is a villain I can kind of root for. Killmonger was the same way because he had very good motivations for what he was doing. His motivations were sound. His motivations for wanting to go after the king of Wakanda and become the king of Wakanda were very, very sound motivations. He actually, in my opinion, in many cases in the movie, had the moral high ground. And that's something that you never saw in the Luke Cage series. You never saw that really with the antagonist. Now, next, an emotional wound. So I like to say heroes aren't born, they're made. Nobody's born doing heroic acts or doing heroic things. It's our experiences, the things that we go through in life that cause people to want to become heroic, to choose jobs like law enforcement and military and becoming firemen and EMTs and so forth, or everyday heroes that step in and do something amazing to help other people out. Typically, there's something very deep going on behind that or beyond that made that person step in and do something. When somebody jumps in front of, when there's a shooting and somebody jumps in front of somebody to save them, or they run and they tackle the shooter, there's something very, very powerful going on there. Probably something that happened in that person's background that made them want to act, that gave them the wherewithal and the will to say, no matter the danger to myself, I'm going to stop this. I'm going to step in, no more. Set that up for your characters. Make sure that you have something in the character's background. It doesn't matter how you reveal it, but make sure you have something in the character's background that is a powerful motivation for them to act heroically, even if they are not a heroic person. Even if your character is an awful human being, or they're, generally, kind of like a coward, or they're a wimp, figure out ways to set up reasons for your character to act heroically. It is going to make that payoff so much better for your readers later on. Okay. All right, so next, learning the vocabulary of fighting. This is an area where I think a lot of writers stumble, where a lot of writers fail. And I understand wanting to put out a lot of books quickly, and I'm all about the 20Books methodology. I think it's great. Reading that stuff early on was very influential in my career. But we also have to do the work, right, as writers. We have to do our research. We have to understand what we're writing about. One of the things, for me anyway, and I'm not the type of person, I own firearms and, I grew up hunting and stuff, but I'm not the type of person that's like really crazy about it. But I know a lot about firearms because of my military background and because of studying self-defense. It's necessary to understand firearms if you're really going to teach people how to protect themselves. And one of the things that pulls me out of a story quicker than anything is when a writer flubs something that has to do with firearms. And as an example, I actually did this on one of my books, and I did it on purpose. So one of my characters carries a Glock 19. And a Glock 19, it is a striker-fired automatic handgun. What that means is it doesn't have an external hammer. It doesn't have something that you cock back in order to make it shoot, okay? So what I said in my book was, the character said that he had his gun cocked and locked, which is how you carry a different firearm that's also an automatic, like a 1911, a 45, caliber 1911. And man, I had the gun people on the internet just like all over me. And it was funny too because it was in another author's reader group, because I'm a reader of his books, that they were jumping all over me. And I was like, okay, well, never again, all right? I'm not going to make my characters fallible. Or at least I needed to explain, why my character would say something like that. I should have probably explained that he doesn't really care about guns that much. So anyway, you got to make sure you understand the vocabulary of fighting. So do you know the difference between a jab, cross, and a hook? Do you know the difference between a parry and a block? What is the difference? Do you understand angles of attack, timing, and footwork? These are all things that fighters understand. People who deal with violence on a daily basis understand these things, so you should probably understand them at least rudimentarily too. I have had authors ask me, well, how do you learn this stuff? Well, obviously the best way is to go and take a class. I think probably taking about 3 or 6 months of Krav Maga is a good way to pick it up because you're going to learn a lot in Krav Maga classes simply because it's an eclectic martial art and there's so many different martial arts involved in Krav Maga. But the other thing is that you can just go and interview people. You can ask people, interview martial arts instructors, ask questions, watch videos. There's so many ways for you to get research done today. It's insane, but don't just rely on Wikipedia and YouTube because most of the stuff on YouTube about self-defense and martial arts is way wrong, okay? And a lot of it's really, really bad. So make sure you find somebody in real life that actually knows what they're talking about and ask them questions. Okay, so understanding violence. And in this section, I'm going to talk about the difference between fantasy violence and real violence, mostly focusing on real violence. So real violence, not even remotely similar to the way it's depicted in television and film. Not even remotely similar. Fights don't last forever. People can't get hit in the face multiple times and get back up. People can't get concussions. You see on TV where, they're like, well, I beat this guy. I can't have him following me. He's still conscious. I'll just knock him out. And, 5 minutes later, in the movie, the person's up and they're awake and they're fine. And they're like, oh, I've got a headache. That's not the way it works in real life. You pistol whip somebody enough to cause them to be unconscious. They're probably going to have a skull fracture. They're going to have ICU for a good long time. So you have to understand the difference. Violence follows rules, both social and physical. And this is something that I teach my students when I'm teaching self-defense seminars, assault prevention seminars, and so forth. As a writer, you want to understand those rules so you can know whether or not you want to break them. And this is so, so important. Because depending on the genre that you're in, if you're writing, for example, gritty, hard-boiled fiction, like your Mickey Spillane type stuff, you need to make your fight scenes very realistic. You can't have your Mickey Spillane type character doing backflips in the middle of a fight because people are going to be like, yeah, I don't think so. Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, that's not what I came to this genre for. I came to experience gritty, realistic violence, and that's what you need to have in your books. Now, on the other hand, for fantasy, you can do whatever you want to do in fantasy so long as you justify it. Justification is really important. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but it bears mentioning now. All right, so we have 3 types of physical conflict. This is in real life. The first is social aggression. This is asserting dominance through violence. One of the reality-based self-defense instructors that I study, he has this thing that he talks about. It's ritualistic combat. It's very common. You've seen it yourself probably, where usually two males are trying to assert dominance. And what he calls it is he calls it the monkey dance because it's like they're both beating their chest. Oops. Okay, like this, and trying to assert dominance. They're running up to each other, and they're bowing up and all this stuff. And it's kind of silly, right? That's actually, honestly, that's the least dangerous form of violence. It can escalate into the second form, which I'll talk about in a second. But it's actually, guys and ladies that know their stuff, self-defense-wise, they see that, and they're just like, oh, my gosh, If I see 2 guys doing that, that's my cue to just to leave the scene. But that's the first kind. The second kind is asocial, sociopathic violence. And this is criminal predation, typically done by professional criminals who understand violence, understand how to inflict violence on other people, and they know how to do it very, very well. Usually they're very practiced. And it happens very quickly, and it's usually over in an instant. And then the third type of violence is war. And the interesting thing about war is that it's typically where non-combatants typically make the decisions in war, okay? And then the people who are actually there, typically they don't want to be there. And I can tell you that from being a vet myself and, talking to people who've been in combat and so forth, typically they don't want to be there, but they're there because of various reasons. So understanding that can kind of go a long way for you understanding how to write military characters in your books. If you don't know anybody who's in the military, you haven't been in the military yourself, and you're writing a character with a military background who's active military in your books, make sure you sit down and talk to a couple of vets, especially people that have actually been in combat, because it's going to help you create more realistic characters. And I can tell you this, I have my first series, which is a zombie apocalypse, a post-apocalyptic series. I get taken to task for the stuff that I have my characters do all the time, and I'm a vet. So, these active military guys that have been to Iraq and Afghanistan, their world's a lot different than the world that I was in the military 20-something years ago. So it's important also to update, the knowledge that you have about these people. Okay, so important to note really quickly, the last 2 are typically performed by professionals. And professionals do not screw around, okay? Simple as that. So if you have somebody that's a professional in your book, you know they're professional at violence, whether they are a professional criminal or they're hitman or they're military, you know, like special forces or something, you want to make sure that you portray that, okay? They're typically not people that, that mince words. They typically don't engage in social aggression, number one. If they have to fight, it's because they're being made to fight, and they're going to take care of business really quickly. Okay, so violence as tells. This is the same stuff I teach in my self-defense seminars. So pre-attack indicators. These are important because these are ways you can write this into your prose, write this into your story, and show things that indicate, you know, like showing instead of telling, obviously, that somebody's about ready to attack someone else. So important. So pre-attack indicators, clenched jaw. You know, you see this a lot when somebody's getting ready to attack someone else. Clenched fist. And believe me, self-defense instructors like myself, we spend like hours watching real-life videos on YouTube and seeing how people attack other people so we can learn to pick these up. Blading the body, which is turning your body to the side like this. Cops are taught to do that. Grooming is very important. If you ever have somebody aggressing towards you, this is just a real-life tip, and they do this or this, they're about to hit you. So get away from them. The thing is, it's subconscious. It's like they, you know, it's instinctive. They don't even know they're doing it. Looking away or the head turn, like the head fake. A lot of criminals do that. Posturing, you know, doing, you know, this or this, you know. That's definitely a cue. When somebody's eyes glaze over, when you're engaging somebody in a heated conversation and things have escalated to the point to where it's pretty severe and that person gets the 1,000-yard stare, it's just all of a sudden they just look off and their eyes go dead, you better get out of there. Nostrils flaring, sweating, eyes widening and pupils dilating. These are all, you know, signals that somebody's had an adrenaline dumped. Trial contact, where somebody will push somebody beforehand, or they'll touch them, or they'll put their finger on them, you know? That's just they're working up their courage to actually commit a serious act of violence. Animated movements, when they're gesticulating a lot. Pacing, like I'm doing right now. Scanning the area, looking around. Criminals will do that because they want to see if anybody's looking, because a criminal doesn't want to get caught. And then repeatedly glancing at targets. Like, for example, if somebody's looking away and then they look at the person's face, and they look away and they look at the person's face again, they're judging distance so they can attack. So these are all things that you can use in your stories to make your criminals and your characters more realistic when they fight. All right, this is the last thing we're going to go over, and I'm going to go over them pretty quick. Mutable laws of violence. First thing is distance. We say proximity negates skill. For all my 35 years of martial arts training, 6 feet, 250 pounds on a good day, if I'm dieting and staying away from pizza, if somebody walks up behind me, hits me over the head with a brick, it's not going to matter. They sneak up on me or they blindside me, you know, all my 35 years of martial arts training goes out the window, okay? So if anybody has a grudge, that's how you're going to get me, okay? But it's important to remember that. Okay? When you have characters get blindsided, if you're writing realistic fight scenes, understand if they get blindsided, they're probably down for the count. Size and numbers. Size matters and numbers matter a lot. One of the things we do in Krav Maga is we will make our students, as they get to advanced levels, fight 2 and 3 opponents at once. And one of the reasons why we do it is partially we tell them is to teach them like distance and angling and, you know, setting people up, you know, lining people up so you're only fighting one person at a time. But really what we're trying to teach them is don't fight 2 and 3 people at once. It's absolutely impossible. My level 2 instructor test, this was at the end of like a 3-day, I was dead. And it was basically 2 3-minute rounds when I fought the 2-on-1 and 3-on-1 of me just walking around like a Pez dispenser. My head just getting, it was awful. Okay, so speed. Whoever gets there first with the most wins. Element of surprise is important, blindsiding somebody, but then also the person that's quicker is the person that is more likely to win that fight. So one of the things we do in Krav Maga, we're taught to immediately address the threat, turn the tables on the person, and we keep aggressing. We use kind of like a shock and awe type principle to keep attacking that person and going for vital targets until the person either goes, you know, like defensive is what we call it, or they're on the ground and we've eliminated the threat. So that is very important, getting there first with the most. Also timing. Interception is superior to evasion. Evasion superior to blocking. So if we can intercept an attack, if I can hit somebody before they hit me, that's the best. If I can get out of the way, that's better still, okay? And, or a little bit less better, I should say, less good. And blocking, you know, is inferior to that. And covering is inferior to trading blows. So the thing is what you don't want to do is you don't want to be trading blows with somebody because the first person that gets a good shot is going to get knocked out. I would prefer not to have to cover like this, but we teach those techniques in Krav Maga because sometimes you need an OS block, like, oh, somebody's attacking me, right? I got to do something. But if you want your character to show that they are vastly superior to somebody else in skill, getting out of the way or being able to hit the other person before they hit them is a very good way to show that. Okay, attrition. Getting hit has consequences. This is what Bruce Lee said, a quote by him: "Fight's not won by one punch or kick, either learn to endure or hire a bodyguard." Yeah, Bruce Lee always got to the point. He was actually a pretty tough guy. But it's true, attrition. If you watch fights where, like MMA fights and so forth, you'll see this a lot where one person's getting the short end of the stick, and typically that ends up showing in the last rounds. Skill differentials count a lot. That's why Hoist Gracie won the first 2 UFCs at 170 pounds, and he was fighting people that were like my size and much, much bigger. It's also why you can find videos, a lot of videos on YouTube actually, of females, professional female, jiu-jitsu fighters and MMA fighters that are able to beat up, in a ring environment, because somebody always wants to test, right? But are able to beat up, guys that are larger than them who aren't very skilled. And there's a lot of proof of that out there. So if a female is highly skilled, there's nothing that says that, that female, just because she's small or whatever, can't beat up a guy, because trust me, it happens all the time. Okay, positioning. Hesitation will get you killed. So always have your characters, if they're smart, they're going to move off the X, is what we say. So you move when the violence starts. You never stand still. Intel, the ability to read an opponent, is so, so important. This famous quote from Sun Tzu, The Art of War: "Know the enemy and know yourself, and you will win 100 of 100 battles." So if your character can get intel on somebody, typically what I do is I'll have my character run into somebody that beats them up, and then I'll have them gather intel on that person and figure out strategy, and then they go back and they win. So that's a good way to justify them winning against somebody who has already beat them up. Strategy. So when all else is equal, and people are equally matched in skill, they're equally matched in physical size and prowess and so forth, strategy is going to make the difference, the person who can strategize. Once again, Musashi, who was a famous swordsman, probably the most famous swordsman in Japanese history, he says, if you don't control the enemy will control you. All right, now will. Ferocity and grit matters a whole lot. I can tell you story after story after story. Some of them have been my students, of people who have been attacked. Okay, I've had 2 female students that have been attacked, date rape scenarios, because that's 70% of the time when a woman is attacked like that. That's how it happens. That fought an attacker off. That was a bigger, stronger, more aggressive attacker, simply because they took training, they knew a little bit of self-defense, but they had a lot of willpower. And I had hammered that into them in training. And I'm so proud of those ladies. But it happens all the time. If your character can out-grit somebody, they're going to win the fight. I think we're running short on time, aren't we? Okay, all right. So why do these rules matter? Number 1, consistency. You want to make sure your characters function at a level consistent with their skills and abilities. Consistency is important for believability in your stories. Laws of physics matter unless they don't, because you rewrote the rules for your characters. So if you're going to rewrite the rules, make sure you make that clear to your readers. Decide which rules to follow in your fight scenes. Make sure you stick with those rules. Don't break the rules or bend them or whatever, or change them on the fly. If you got to change a rule for however you've made up your fantasy world or what have you, your science fiction world, make sure that you explain it to your characters beforehand. Doing so reduces the eye roll factor in your novels and stories. Rationale. If your character punches above their weight, if they defeat somebody or they're fighting toe-to-toe with somebody who is much better, much stronger, much more capable, et cetera, than them, you need to have a good reason why. And then, of course, loss and struggle. Essential to telling good stories. When your characters lose, provide a solid reason for that as well. All right, so how can fights be won? Your main character can outsmart someone. They can outskill them. They can outgrit them, willpower. Physically overpower the opponent. Or they can win by luck. And sometimes that's just kind of funny to throw a wrench in the gears. You just got to beware of Deus Ex Machina, but sometimes it is kind of, funny to, have somebody slip on a banana peel, and then, that's how the character wins the fight, so. All right. Final things. Let no one escape unscathed. Make sure that there's consequences for violence. Again, make your characters bleed, then make them bleed some more. And remember the Pyrrhic victory in real life, everything comes at a cost. So decide their cost, and then make your characters pay it, and make it, let the readers know how they're paying that cost. And then killing off characters is always a good way to keep people guessing. So just don't kill off the Darth Maul. All right, and then finally do your research. Research is important. It's going to make your fight scenes believable. Okay? All right. So, justifying the outlandish. I'll leave you guys with that. We don't have time for Q&A because I talked too long, but I will be out in the hallway. If anybody wants to ask me questions about anything, you're welcome to ask me questions. I'll wait out there for about 15 minutes after we're done here. Okay? All right. Thanks.